Excellent. Here we all are. I was just doing a quick head count to make sure we're all where we should be. And indeed we are. And it's great to see your messages coming in the chat this morning. I'm appreciating all of the weather updates. So far, I'm not envious of anyone else because it's rainy, wet, soggy, just about everywhere. But it's really nice if you want to introduce yourself in there. Do pop any messages you may have. It's always good to see who's joining us and from where. Cornwall looks to be the furthest point so far. Sunny-ish Cornwall. Well, we are all a little bit envious of that. Thank you, Charlie. So yes, continue your conversation and getting to know each other there. And let me introduce to you who we've got here in front of you. Thank you so much for joining us at Communicate 2022. We are so excited to bring it back again, and this time with a difference, because for the first year in the conference's history, we're welcoming delegates online. We've got sessions like this and also live and in-person workshops and masterclasses. So today in London and tomorrow in Bristol. And as I'm seeing on the chat, it really is so wonderful to see such an interesting mixture of people amongst the audience. I know we've got people who are part of NGOs, the public sector, the media, academia, green business, and you'll all get the chance to network with each other and hopefully make some good connections. I will just welcome one of you in Portugal, you lucky person. That's Europe's sunniest, it's got Europe's sunniest capital, I think, if memory serves. In case you don't already know, Communicate is an initiative of the Natural History Consortium. So 14 partners working together to get people involved with the natural world. And it is a crucial year for the environment. I know it feels like we often say this. And as organisations and audiences continue to face challenges, the team have been very busy behind the scenes creating a programme that's packed full of opportunities, inspiration, practical help, alongside some of the networking sessions. Now, this year's overall theme is amplifying awareness, focusing action, and it really does give us all a chance to get to the heart of environmental communication in these uncertain and challenging times. My name is Laura Rawlings. I'm part of the team at BBC Bristol, and I'm going to be your host for this session. And we're going to be exploring the themes of Communicate 2022 in light of current headlines. So in a few moments' time, we'll be delving into some of the stories that have been shared online and in the papers today and over the last couple of days, and also in light of policy changes. And we'll be setting a personal challenge to each of you as well. Now, joining me to get the conversation started, you can see them here in front of you, but let me do the official introductions. We've got Marian Spain, who's from Natural England. Welcome, Marian. We've got Mike Collins, who's from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, UKRI. Hello. And we've got Harry Bowell from the National Trust. So thanks for joining us, the three of you. I would just like to whiz around, just in case people haven't met you before, don't know too much about what you do. We have got a moment to hear from each of you about what you're working on. So Harry, let me start with you. Harry in Sheffield.
Thanks, Laura. And Liz, I saw that Liz Ballard from Sheffield Wildlife Trust has joined. Lizzie Lyne, it's beautifully sunny here in Sheffield today. Everyone should be, it's not really, it's down Corridor Road, like everywhere it would appear. So yeah, I'm Harry, I'm Director of Land and Nature for the National Trust. So I lead all of the Trust work on nature recovery, on climate, and on people's connection with nature. Most materially, because of our land holding, that's got a real focus on the National Trust land holding, but increasingly interested in how we work with others sort of beyond National Trust boundaries in coalition, and we'll probably come and talk about some of the recent events that we've been involved with.
Okay, thank you very much, Harry. Moving around to you, Mike.
Thanks, Laura. My name is Mike Collins. I'm Head of Public Engagement at the Arts and Humanities Research Council. So we're one of 7 research councils, which is part of UK Research and Innovation. And in terms of what I do, me and my team are all about encouraging researchers to think about how they engage the public in research, both in terms of participation in research, but telling the story of research. And over the last year, we've delivered quite a lot of activity in the run-up to COP26 this time last year, and then some subsequent work that's come off the back of that, as well as collaborating with other research councils on large initiatives. So, for example, we have one really exciting initiative called the Treescapes Ambassadors, which is both looking at the role of trees in terms of carbon, but also the role of trees, for example, in urban landscapes and helping to keep places slightly cooler. So fundamentally, it's about the sort of link between the research that people do and the sort of connection with the public.
Okay, thank you, Mike. And Marian, tell us about you and what your role is.
Hello, everybody. I'm Marian Spain, Chief Executive for Natural England. I'm in a very rainy Reading this afternoon and a very featureless office building. The large white blank behind me is the wall. Apologies, there's nothing nice to look at. So we are officially the government statutory nature conservation body for England, which means we sort of do three things. We have a regulatory role for nature and wildlife and landscape. We have a role to deliver on behalf of government. So we're very focused at the moment on the new work coming out of the Environment Act and focused on what will soon be announced, the new government-backed targets for nature. But we also, probably the more interesting bit of our role, if I dare put it that way, we are out there delivering on the ground. So our mission, our published ambition is that we are about building partnerships for nature recovery. And of course, that means we have to communicate and engage. We have to communicate with our customers, the people we regulate, the people we ask action of. We also need to communicate with our partners, people like Harry. But we also increasingly have to communicate with the public because, as we often say, we can't protect nature and we certainly can't recover nature just by the work that bodies like us and the NGOs and academics do. We also have to have businesses, landowners and individual members of the public making the right choices for nature.
Okay, thank you very much. That's really handy just to get exactly where you're at with what you do. So the focus on day one is putting nature at the heart of the conversation. And while you're listening to what our panelists have got to say, I'd like to invite you to start thinking about your own organisation's perspectives as well. So to kick us off, as we are all here today, how well do you think we're doing collectively at putting nature at the heart of the conversation? Marian, let me come to you for that.
We are doing better. I think nature is more discussed. It's more discussed by politicians, and I think it is increasingly discussed by the other audiences I was mentioning earlier, landowners and farmers, businesses, and the public. And I think one of the reasons for that is over the last few years, it's partly something I hinted at earlier, the narrative is moving on from protecting nature to restoring nature. It's a more proactive and therefore perhaps a more engaging conversation, but also a more challenging conversation. But I also think the thing that's changed is a theme we might want to think about in our session today, and of course for everybody as we go forward. The way we're talking about nature, I think, is changing. We're now able to confidently offer nature as a solution. When I started in this world 30 years ago, nature was something that only those that really cared about wildlife did, and we only talked to each other and we talked our own language, and it was about nature for nature's sake. I think now we are increasingly able to back up to evidence and therefore to communicate confidently that nature is a solution. It's good for our health and well-being. It's the prerequisite to sustainable food production. It's vital for economic security. And I think that means we are able to talk a lot more confidently. But we shouldn't be complacent, should we? Because again, as some of the topics that the conference will be diving into over the next couple of days, there are many other things that may well knock nature off people's radar. Cost of living crisis, food security, climate versus nature. We might return to that theme during the conversation. We used to talk about one or the other. We've increasingly started to talk about the two together. So I think my summary is doing better, but still no room for complacency to lose the ground we've won, and also still lots more ground we need to take.
Yeah.
So Laura, can I add a couple of things to that, if I may?
Do.
So
yeah.
completely agree with everything said by Marian. I just perhaps two additions. One is, I think, events, if you like, have also changed people's perception of nature. And I think one of the very few upsides of COVID, I think future history writers might look back at COVID response and people's connection on an everyday level with nature and the impact and power that had in people's lives, may be a bit of a sort of turning point. I think it's incumbent upon us collectively, everyone in this conference, to really be mindful of that, but also think about how we communicate that in a way which people can connect with, perhaps with that fairly recent history. And then the second thing, the last few weeks have been sort of mad from a nature communication perspective, in particular in relation to our response to government. And I took great store by the join up in the sector, not just with the NGOs, but actually a really wide community response of people really standing up for nature. And when it was under threat, and I don't think that threat has completely gone away, but when it was particularly under threat a few weeks ago, I think the response in a really joined up way around the way we communicated that response, I took great heart from, actually.
Thank you. You make a good point there. Mike, would you like to add anything on this about how well we're doing at putting nature at the heart of the conversation?
Yeah, I think Harry's point is an important one about the sort of impact of COVID. I remember when the first lockdown, opening the front door to go for our one walk a day and just being able to hear the bird song. And actually that sort of moment, the only other day of the year you could usually do that was Christmas Day. So actually the way that you could connect and going out on a walk and finding, two people sort of emerging from a hedgerow with an app they downloaded to try and identify the different trees. So I think it sort of almost turbocharged some of that connection and that sense of, because we were all in the sort of state that we'd never been in, actually that sense of loss. I think there is also something optimistic around. There's a lot of really amazing community initiatives. There's a lot of real people-powered work happening to restore nature, to connect people to nature. And then I think collectively the movement has the unified reaction to the challenges around some of the proposals of the brief Liz Truss government. Obviously, we've seen some of the challenges around sewage ending up in the sea and rivers as well. That actually feels that the movement is starting to speak with a more unified voice. And also the tone as well. There was a real sense that the sort of tone was stronger and more forceful in a way that maybe 5-10 years ago it wouldn't have been. That I think the sort of connection between the real, the challenges we see now from the climate emergency and what that means, and actually we need to do everything in our power to protect and restore nature, and that anything that challenges that, people were reacting. So I think you could really see the conservation movement coming together to do that, and then the public really getting behind that as well. So I think that was a big change in the way that people communicated about the challenges facing the natural world.
Laura, can I just add one additional thought, which Mike's just triggered, which is my boss Hilary McGrady, the Director General of National Trust, talks about, when she talks about communication, she talks about 2 ears, 1 mouth. And we often think about communication about how we broadcast to our audience, and I'm increasingly intrigued by the notion about how we actively listen and modify our approach as a result of that. And I think one of the things that came out of COVID for us is the real inequality of access to nature, and it's really making us think as we go into a sort of turn of our strategy page, if you like, about, well, what is our response to that? So if people really value this stuff, and we know it's important, how do we respond to?
Okay, well, this may take us forward. Yeah, so in terms of 2 ears, 1 mouth, it's about using them in that proportion, isn't it? So how could we be bolder and more courageous then? All the things that we've learned, all that we've observed, going forward, how can we be more bold, Harry? Speedy one from you.
Well, as I was thinking about this sort of question, thinking it might come up, I was actually thinking about the Emily Maitlis lecture, which I thought was one of those seminal things about communication I've seen this year. And if people haven't seen it, do seek it out, because I thought it was really thoughtful. And basically, at the heart of her argument was that effectively communicators need to own the ground more, and not have the ground owned by people who might be not favourable to our agenda. So I think there's something for me about not necessarily feeling cowed by some of the anti-nature communicators, and just being braver at standing into that and finding our own locus for doing that. And it's a really easy thing to say, which is why we have brilliant communications directors in organisations like the National Trust to help us make sense of that. But I thought that was really, it was real food for thought for me about how we do that.
Will Ellie, who is behind the scenes sorting the production, she'll have a look and see if she can find a link to that lecture, because we'll try and share anything useful that comes up. Oh, there we go. Looks like Mark may have done
Mark
that.
Fennell. See, that's why we have communications directors like Mark at the National Trust.
He's got your back. Brilliant. Marian, how do we go forward and be more courageous?
I was reflecting, listening to Harry and Mike speaking then. Apparently, you make a throwaway comic and it comes back to haunt you. Apparently, 3 or 4 years ago, I said to a colleague, I'm going to stop apologising for what I do. And I think there was a sense of that in the conversation we've had. I used to sort of gloss over it at parties when people asked me because I didn't think they'd be interested. And now they are. And now it just feels like the public mood has changed, doesn't it? But I think that prompts us that I'm going to throw 3 thoughts out. I'll throw them out as sort of challenges, if I may.
Please do.
I think we are not yet speaking to everybody. I think Harry's point about exclusion from nature and gross inequalities of access to nature through a whole number of factors. So I think we have to make sure we are, well, not just speaking to everybody, but listening to everybody. I think that's another important thing. We risk transmitting what we understand and what we believe rather than putting ourselves in other people's shoes and offering them what they need. I think that's a real challenge for our sector and how we communicate. I think the second thing, I think we sometimes over-rely on facts and figures. Many of you remember Stephanie Hilborn when she was at the Wildlife Trust, and I learned a phrase from Stephanie about misery stats. Stop using the misery stats. And I happened to hear, I caught something on the radio the week, I think it was a lady from the Church of England was talking about climate change and how we do not change people's attitudes by numbers. And she even dared criticize Greta Thunberg, gosh, shock horror, who apparently has published a book called Climate Change, The Facts. And this woman I heard on the radio speaking very compelling, we don't make decisions on our head, we make decisions with our hearts. So I think there's something about not just producing numbers, but giving people stories, giving people hope. And I think that was the third theme. I noticed somebody in the chat has hinted at this. I think we don't do as well as we could about really bringing this live to people of what it means where they live, what's going on in your place, what could be better in your place, what you could do in your place. I think, national bodies like us, of course, often don't start at the national. I think the more we can get right down to an individual and their household and their community and offer positives and positive stories, we will win over a lot more people.
Yes, and it's funny actually, because when you said about not relying on the figures and the facts and the scary numbers, I look at our program and think about some of the people who are excellent communicators about nature and the environment. And if I look at maybe their social media accounts, you fall in love with the stories and the little tiny micro details of a miniature mushroom that wouldn't even fit on the end of your finger, yeah. Mike, from you, what would you add?
I think there is something really powerful and compelling about the storytelling element that Marian just talked about. And a couple of weeks ago, it was a Saturday night, and half our household was watching Strictly Come Dancing. So I sat down with my son to watch the Lorax, which I'd read a lot of times, and I'd never watched the animation, the latest one. And actually, that book came out in 1971, 50 years ago, and it's one of the most powerful storytelling pieces I've seen about environmental loss and greed and the impact, and actually a realization that something's gone really badly wrong. And I think that's something that the movement needs, the power of stories, the power of taking it down to that individual level. And last year, as part of some work that HRC funded, we funded 15 projects across the UK where young people were being engaged with climate research in a conversational way. And one of the best examples was that an animator, an anthropologist and a climate scientist worked with young people in Newquay that they weren't part of any climate strike movement, they weren't part of any pressure groups or environmental groups, but they just had conversations on Fistral Beach in Newquay just to talk about what's the impact of climate change now to their lives, what's the impact and what can they do about the future. And off the back of that, they created some really, really powerful animations. So I think that's where bringing together the science and the stories is so important. And I think the points that everyone's made around just feels there's lots of scary graphs. There's usually pictures used on the TV of a polar bear floating away on a broken bit of ice sheet. And actually what we need is to bring it turn to the human level and what it means to us where we live. And I think that sort of growth in nature writing in the last decade or so has helped that. But I'd imagine that over the last few years, more and more people have started to express what their local green places mean to them and the importance of those wild places. So I think bolder storytelling, and I also think that sort of calling out bad practice, which I think, again, I've noticed that the environment movement is doing much more strongly now, is really important in the way that other ethical elements of bad business or bad practice would be called out.
Yeah, and just looking at the chat whilst you're all talking, you know, lots of people supporting what you're saying about storytelling and that connection to individuals to that place where they are, but also not being afraid of bringing home the gravitas of the situation as well. Okay.
If I might, Lorna, there's also a couple there about seeing people like them taking action. I think really playing that very inclusive messaging, very inclusive stories. And Mike just said something there that chimed with me as well. I think, again, people don't necessarily come to understanding nature because they think about nature. They think about art, or they think about their community, or they think about heritage, either of their own family or the place they live. And I think, again, we need to sort of find different lenses in, different entry points. And a colleague of mine always talks very compellingly as well. Again, those of us that work in conservation, we can be a bit snobbish, aren't we? We only care about the rare and the special stuff. What a lot of people care about is the squirrel in their local park, and let's use that squirrel. And I won't mention trees at this point, but you know, we engage with people on the nature they come to love, and or the art they come to love.
Very true. And we will move on to our stories from today, but there's a great point that Christina raises in the chat to say stories are remembered up to 22 times more than facts alone, according to a Solitaire article, which is very interesting for all of us to take on board. So we have pulled together a selection of articles. We're going to whiz through these. There's a couple from today and a couple from previous days. And we're going to start off. The first one is, the headline is COP27, without Greta, activists make waves at climate summit. So young people are a more powerful force than ever in the UN climate summit. This is what the UN's youngest climate advisor tells BBC News in Egypt. So these are young people who say that we've made huge effort to be here and we want to call out any greenwashing. We want to be inside the tent trying to make change rather than being on the outside of it. And there are some really inspiring stories from people who've made a huge effort to actually be there, and also their very personal stories about how their lives have already been affected. Who would like to start on this one? Harry, you were nodding at the right point there. So I feel, you know, this is powerful. The thing that I hadn't appreciated, it's the first time that young people have had a dedicated space at COP. They've got a children and youth pavilion, and apparently it's buzzing. So let's start with the positives about perhaps previously unheard voices getting a platform there.
Yeah, so I have three things I took from that article. One, I found it slightly joyous and uplifting, and I mean, do we need that, particularly a COP summit? So I thought there was something just rather just marvellous and hopeful about it tucked up in the story. There was an interesting point, I think, about, and it's kind of in the juxtaposition of the headline about comms strategy, about who we work with, and what the young people who are at COP are advocating, that they're working with the institutions, and that and Greta is suggesting that, you know, that isn't the way to go. What I took from that actually is, of course, we need both. We need organisations and individuals who want to work with the grain of institutions and current, and then we need communication, which is about challenge and an external voice. And then I thought the whole thing about representation and story through the eyes of lived experience is a really, really powerful thing. You know, the people being affected by climate change and young people being affected by climate change seems to be a really powerful thing for global leaders to hear. So I thought it was a sort of hopeful article.
Yeah, agreed. There's a young person, Aisha from Pakistan, who said that, you know, having, in light of the floods, just saying, for me, the stakes are so high that I can't give up hope for change. You know, there are some really strong lines in it. Anyone else want to add anything briefly to this one before we move on to the next story, or has Harry done a good job of covering the key points? You're all happy?
The
Happy
only
with
thing I was
Harry.
also briefly going to add is I think it's that sort of refreshing honesty. And I think, younger people probably don't have all of the, sometimes the filters we have as we get older, where we don't want to upset people. So they have, and obviously they can see, and I know, a lot is talked about things like eco-anxiety and the worry of what, climate change is here now, it's not something in the future. So I think having those voices, the different generations, because there is a risk that lots of these big climate change summits, when you see the pictures of the leaders together or the diplomats, it's just a sea of mainly white men, isn't it? So all men. So I think having those diversity of voices, allowing people to have their say, is so important, because they have the lived experience of what climate change means now, and I think that adds a real power to these summits.
Yeah, agreed. There was also a point in there where there was a couple of young people who'd come from Bangladesh, and whilst they'd got grants for travel and hotels, they couldn't actually afford to eat at the conference. So, trying to support people to have a place at the table. And there's another question about that. Let's move on to the second story. So this is about numbers, and I'm sure everyone's heard it because it's in the main headlines today, how the world got to 8 billion and where next. So this has been widely reported, but this was a particular a piece that we took from the BBC News online website. So the global population has hit 8 billion. The UN's announced this. And how did we get there? So there is a very interesting video about this, and I do suggest you take a look. They did have an example where they used numbers in a really good way. So 8 billion is hard for most of us to fathom, but the presenter of this piece, Stephanie Hegarty, said, if I showed you one person every second, it would take 253 years to get through them all. Oh, suddenly I've got a sense of what you're on about now. So you can work well with big figures, but Marian, let me come to you. How do you feel when you hear this headline? Are you part of the team that is thinking this is something to celebrate, we're living longer, or are you more cautious for the planet?
I think what it makes us think is, how do we make sure we have got resilient nature that these people can benefit from? I'm trying awfully hard not to use the word environmental limits, but I've just used it, haven't I? And there are environmental limits, but we can expand those environmental limits. Some of the environmental limits we see now, for example, coming right back to the UK from that global thing, we are seeing a real challenge now to find space and places for new housing, because the water quality from existing housing and for farming is already causing us problems. So one reaction to that is to stop more housing. The appropriate reaction is, how do we continue to build resilience in that ecosystem? How do we remove sources of pollution so that we can accommodate change, accommodate more? So there's something about not seeing population growth as a problem, but as a prompt that we need to sustain our ecosystems better, sustain nature better. I think the other thing it prompts for me, and this wasn't a population conversation in the UK, but many people, and the conversation is still live, of course, many people over the last 6 to 12 months, because of other global situations, particularly the war in the Ukraine, the dialogue about food security has become more prevalent. And in some places that risks being polarizing. It risks saying we can either choose to have food from our land and nature from our land. The job for people like us is to talk about, and also, of course, deliver the fact that we can have both, that environmental security is actually the route to food security and resource security. So that's two thoughts it prompted for me, how we continue to tell that story, that people are not a problem. It is the fact that we do not have fully functioning ecosystems that is the problem.
Yeah, it's coming up for a solution for our activities. We'd still have a climate crisis, even if we reduce the population. I'm going to move along, Mike. This one's coming in your direction. So story number 3, COP27 must pave the way for a Paris moment for nature, says the UN. So this was reported in the last couple of days in The Guardian. The outcome of climate summit is crucial to ensuring strong targets at COP15 in December, warns biodiversity head. This is an interesting one. Where shall we go with this? What was your initial impression from this article?
I think that's obviously to reflect on the Paris Climate Change Summit, where I suppose for the first time it did have those legal binding targets, but actually whether they've been met. I think it's all in terms of, I suppose it's about how you change the narrative in terms of sort of national, international level around the importance of strong legal protection for our natural world, whether that's creating more marine nature reserves or whether it's expanding national parks or greater protection for green spaces. So I think it's something where it's probably also partly a realization that it maybe didn't already exist, was a bit sort of, why is it taking so long? I mean, we've been having international climate change or international environmental summits since the early 1970s, and then we had Rio, the big one, in 1992. So I think it was that sort of sense of also slight frustration that we just, I suppose, about how you bring nations together to create these opportunities and have these legally binding agreements.
Do you feel optimistic, given that it says in the article, it's reporting that, you know, there will be an absence of world leaders, it clashes with the World Cup. I wonder how optimistic you feel about this as being, well, it is indeed. But whether this is going to be the place where these things happen.
I think in some ways I suppose on a personal level, it should be that the COP27 and COP15 should be the same event in a way. They're linked. You can't separate them. And the climate emergency is affecting the natural world, and the more we use natural resources, it generates climate change. So they're inextricably linked, and you can't separate them. I think back to a point I made, I think the hope I have is more about what's happening at a sort of the ground up, both in terms of communities, but also organisations from the people that are here today representing, that actually those changes have come. But I think you can't separate the two. So I think it's that sort of, I think it's, you have to remain optimistic.
Harry, a very quick point from you before we have the last one.
So I think it is a challenge for us, a communication challenge about nature and climate as being one rather than two. And then just the power of a galvanising idea and targets. The 1.5 climate thing has been galvanising. 30 by 30 could be similarly galvanising. So, and I think we need to think about how we utilise that as a communications network as something that we really want to drive towards.
Okay.
I even had a minister put it to me recently, Laura, that we haven't yet given the public something to rally around for nature. We haven't got a single simple idea. We've got a whole suite of statutory targets coming, but they're not going to excite individuals. And I think there is, whether it's 30 by 30, whether it's reversing decline in species, I think that's, again, it's a communication and a policy challenge, isn't it? That what is the thing that the world and this nation aspires to achieve in the next 10 years?
Well, if anyone has any thoughts on this, do put them in the chat box as we're going. Just 1 minute on this last one. This is an article about social media, how social media drives the climate agenda, COP27 and the influence of Twitter, and it goes through various different Twitter influencers and how more conversation happened just before it all began, talk about global carbon dioxide emissions increasing, also conversations about Coca-Cola, and the sponsorship and the backlash that happened there, which I think is interesting. Who would like to add just a burning point on this? Is anyone keen to comment on this? Are we?
The comment I had is I'm really glad I'm not a communications professional. I found it intriguing that there was a global influencer score and you could be 89. It was a completely different world to the one in which I occupy. That's all I take from that.
Mike or Marian, any comments on this?
I'm a fan of social media, actually, in its broader sense, because it's the point Harry made at the beginning. The listening as well as transmitting, you get blooming instant feedback if you've got it right or wrong, don't you? I think that for me is the power of social media. It's massive. You can hear from everybody and it's real time. You don't publish something and then wait. When I was young, you waited for the press cuttings a week later. Now you know that.
So true. Yeah, you're right. And there is a role in accountability then as part of what we're saying here, and a democratization in terms of who puts a point forward. As well as all the other challenges that we know goes with that. Okay, let us move along to the final part of our conversation. The conference editorial committee has chosen winning back our audiences as the theme for tomorrow, and we'll be looking at the impact of eco-anxiety, which I know we've already mentioned, greenwash and competing priorities. So in our remaining 9 minutes now, what do you think, and I know we've touched on this, but it's a chance to bring it up a little bit more, what do you think are biggest challenges in taking the audience with us? Marian, I'll come to you because you did touch on this, I guess, when you talked about the obvious, going into a recession, cost of energy, everything else. What would you add on this point?
I think I'll try not to repeat what I said earlier, but I think perhaps more expanding. I think it is about continuing to offer nature as a solution and to talk about the good it does. A very real immediate example of that I had, back to that storytelling, I will tell you the story. I was up in Wigan a couple of weeks ago launching a new nature reserve right in the heart of Wigan, restored Mineland. Anyway, I won't bore you with the story because you'll all have seen it in the media because of Natural England's brilliant communications team, of course. But anyway, what I heard then was from the Chief Executive of Wigan Council, who is she is right in the heart of dealing with what the cost of living crisis means for some of the more deprived families and communities in the country. And even though she is dealing with this massive social services challenge, a massive challenge she has working with charities and voluntary groups, she came along to this event. She gave up a morning to come to this event. And she said to me, the wonderful thing about this is it is literally free, because it is free at the point of access. You don't pay to go to a nature reserve, but also because it is right in the heart of the community. Nobody has to pay to travel. And there was a school group there, and she said if they'd had to get a minibus, they wouldn't be there. And I thought that very sort of powerful thing of being able to tell the story that nature is really good for us, and it is not always, but often free. I thought was a real reminder that we shouldn't say just because there's a cost of living crisis, we pay back on nature. Even more of a reason to keep pushing the benefits.
Thank you. Who else would like to add anything on this? Mike, let me come to you.
I think there's something important about the role of nature and connection with nature, and the themes that we picked up on so far around sort of mental health and well-being. I mean, there's certainly sort of the fields that we've started to fund quite a bit more research around environmental humanities and medical humanities. So concepts around things like social prescribing, preventative healthcare interventions, and actually the sort of importance of green space and the lessons we all learned from those first lockdowns when we had that 1 day walk a day, actually that we don't lose that and that we continue that, and that you get that sort of connectivity to the spaces where we live and work. I'm a trustee at Bath City Farm, and there's, the City Farm movement is a really important movement in terms of providing access to green space, often the size, half the size of a football pitch, really small, but really in areas that are often really deprived and don't have that access to nature or to food or to understand connections with the natural world. So I think there is something around how nature can, I suppose, making it personal is something I think is really in a good way, where it's really important in terms of areas around mental health and well-being, particularly around physical health and some of the challenges we're facing as a nation around improving and people's mental health and tackling mental health and well-being.
Yeah. Harry.
Quickies for me. One is kind of a build, I think, from Marian and Mike is something about powerlessness, and people really care. We know that people really care about nature, but in amongst all the catastrophe, how do people get locus on their everyday life, and so a comms challenge is, are we really clear about how we enable people to make a change? And it's got to be beyond that, beyond join the National Trust or a Wildlife Trust or RSPB or vote. That simply isn't enough. So it's sort of, what are the everyday actions in a really simple way that give people locus and power? And then the other comms challenge, and this is maybe an institutional perspective, is that the challenge is massive. And what we, and I'll talk specifically about the National Trust, are known for is not necessarily the thing that is going to give a solution now. So you might think about the National Trust and think about country houses. Well, actually, what we need to do in response to 21st century challenges we're talking about today is something quite different. So there's a comms challenge, and I would level that at quite a lot of organisations in the sector, from local authorities to even the RSPB. What they're known for isn't necessarily the work that is required. And I think there's a big comms shift challenge required there.
Thank you. There's an interesting point that I think Mark Funnell raised in the chat, just saying something about the People's Assembly for Nature, really bringing it to where individuals are at, and the next step, literally the next thing, action that they could do or that would make a difference to them with that connection. It looks very empowering. Miriam, you also asked who picked this theme. The conference editorial committee is the team that picked this theme. Very briefly from each of you, because we've just got 4 minutes left, I have a sense of what you might say. So do you think social media has impacted the environmental communication sector for better or for worse? Is there a preferred platform that you enjoy? Mike, speedily from you, yes or no, and a detail about that.
Yeah, yes and no, probably. Yes, in a way that it's provided opportunities for more voices to be heard. And no, some of the sort of, I suppose, misinformation, good old fake news, as we sort of had to say at some points. But I think, yeah, social media is a really important role in terms of engaging conversations. And I suppose it's also thinking about, particularly next generation, what platforms do they use? So my 2 teenagers spend most of their time on TikTok. So are we all on TikTok, doing stuff on TikTok, engaging through TikTok? Whereas social media such as Twitter is more about policy and echo chamber. So going to where people consume content and connect.
It's good news, actually. We have got a conversation about TikTok in the programme, so if you haven't spotted it, have a look. Marian, social media, are you on it? What do you think?
I think I answered this one already. I think it's
you did
because of feedback. So I'm going to be cheeky and,
good point.
And use my last minute to comment on something else that I spotted in the chat. Somebody quite correctly picking us up on risking using policy speak, and nature is good for you, and therefore there's something again about avoiding that top-down transmission. And I think social media gives us a much better opportunity to reach out and listen and hear bottom-up responses and frame communications. And if I was clever on chat, I would put a link in there. I will see if I can get one of my colleagues who hopefully is listening.
Ellie may be able to do it for you.
The Climate Creatives Challenge, a competition that's running at the moment, which is about how do we find inviting people to come forward with messages and images that tell the story of nature and climate in a more creative way by linking into arts and other ways in which people engage.
Okay, so as you're opening up, you're mentioning a challenge there for other people. Perhaps this is our last point here. What's the most important question that our delegates should be asking themselves and each other over the next couple of days? Miriam, you can add your point on this one. Most important question our delegates should be asking themselves.
Do you mean me? Do you mean Marian?
Sorry, Marian.
Let's see, double checking there isn't another.
That's because, yes, that's because
I
just mentioned
no, just saying,
Marian.
is there somebody else I should be?
No, not someone else in chat.
The most important question is, who should I be listening to?
Okay. Excellent, succinct. Harry, feel free to add your thoughts.
Marian was so succinct, I'm going to too. So striking the right balance between crisis and hope, and in our stories. And then the other is thinking about a whole ecosystem, and particularly for the big organisations represented, how you're thinking about internal comms, which is as important as external comms around organisational confidence and congruence. So think internal and external, not just external.
And Mike, last word from you.
2 brief ones, I suppose. One is around how do we reach the audiences that are not engaged in discussions about climate change, so the harder to reach audiences. And I suppose it's sort of opportunities around collaboration with researchers, as you expect me to say, in terms of knowledge exchange. There are amazing researchers out there who you can work with to tell those stories and to provide the evidence. So that sort of importance of collaboration across different research disciplines.
Okay, well, thank you very much, one and all. Thank you to you for watching this. You're going to have a short comfort break until 11, and that's when the next session begins. You have got a choice between how can organisations support working class nature writers and audiences, so picking up on what Mike was saying there, those groups of people who are traditionally underrepresented, or you could join what's the role of direct activism in getting the message across, which is very topical at the moment. So that's all starting here on Zoom at 11. We'll see you back here shortly. Big thank you to Marian Spain, to Mike Collins, and to Harry Bowell for joining us. And thank you for being involved and sharing your thoughts as we've gone through the session. It's been so good to hear your instant feedback. I think we all really appreciate that and have lots to take away. So thank you one and all. We'll be starting back at 11. Take care.